Constantius I reigned during the great persecution of the Christians. So how did his son Constantine and the resulting Christianized empire handle this troubled legacy? There is a dearth of evidence for Constantius's personal religious beliefs. In fact, as we found in a previous video, it seems that before the year 312, the numismatic, epigraphic and literary evidence simply points to an emperor who followed the typical tetrarchic religious policy. Yet, his relationship with the Christian religion may be more complex and nuanced than this. After Constantine's victory over Maxentius at the Milvian Bridge, Constantine made official policy decisions that benefited the Christian religion, including full and explicit toleration, the return of confiscated property, and gifts and honours to bishops. This was the beginning of Constantine's explicit Christianization of the Roman Empire, a process which would intensify as his reign continued. This means that the surviving sources regarding Constantius's religion and relationship to Christianity that post-date the Battle of the Milvian Bridge are influenced by Constantine and his Christian policy. Obviously, no epigraphic or numismatic evidence will exist 6 years after Constantius's death, so all we have are literary sources that mainly come from Christian writers. The first Christian writer we shall consider is Lactantius, who was from the eastern half of the empire. The relevant work, On the Deaths of Persecutors, was written sometime after the year 315. This work is apologetic in nature, and the message Lactantius aims to communicate is that those who oppose the Christian God have terrible fates in store for them, while those who don't will be granted prosperity and success. Lactantius has the following to say regarding Constantius. Quote, Herculeus, a person of no merciful temper, yielded ready obedience, and enforced edicts throughout his dominions of Italy. Constantius, on the other hand, lest he should have seemed to dissent from the injunctions of his superiors, permitted the demolition of churches and mere walls, and those things capable of being built up again, but he preserved entire that true temple of God, which is the human body. End quote. You may have already realised why this piece of evidence must be approached with caution. Firstly, no writer would want to offend Constantine and his new regime, especially Christian writers that owed their religious freedom to him. Secondly, in this work, Constantius's attitude to Christians must be positive for Lactantius's narrative to survive. Constantius died of natural causes and had an extremely successful heir. There is no room in Lactantius's framework for Constantius to be anything except tolerant. Yet Lactantius still concedes that Constantius engaged somewhat in the persecution by destroying some buildings. The next work we will look at is the Church History by Eusebius, another Easterner from Caesarea. This is an ambitious work that aims to tell the entire history of Christianity, and it was completed some time before the year 323. Eusebius heaps praises upon Constantius, and utilises the same theme of Lactantius by describing how Constantius's friendly conduct to Christians brought him success and a good end. Yet there is a key difference. Eusebius denies that Constantius destroyed any buildings. The relevant passage reads as follows, quote, Not long after, the Emperor Constantius, who through his entire life was most kindly and favourably disposed towards his subjects, and most friendly to the divine word, ended his life in the common course of nature, and left his own son, Constantine, as emperor and Augustus in his stead. He was the first that was ranked by them among the gods, and received after death every honour which one could pay to an emperor. He was the kindest and mildest of emperors, and the only one of those of our day that passed all the time of his government in a manner worthy of his office. Moreover, he conducted himself toward all most favourably and beneficently. He took not only the smallest part in the war against us, but preserved the pious that were under him unharmed and unabused. He neither threw down the church buildings, nor did he devise anything else against us. The end of his life was honourable and thrice blessed. He alone at death left his empire happily and gloriously to his own son as successor, one who was in all respects most prudent and pious. End quote. Constantius gets mentioned in one of Eusebius' other works called The Life of Constantine, which he was still working on when he died in 339, which was 2 years after Constantine's death. The work is known for hyperbole and excess praise on behalf of Constantine, and omission or downplaying of any flaws or problems with Constantine's reign. The relevant passage goes as follows, quote, At a time when 4 emperors shared the administration of the Roman Empire, Constantius alone, following a course of conduct different from that pursued by his colleagues, entered into the friendship of the supreme God, for while they besieged and wasted the churches of God, levelling them to the ground, and obliterating the very foundations of the houses of prayer, he kept his hands pure from their abominable impiety, and never in any respect resembled them. They polluted their provinces by the indiscriminate slaughter of godly men and women, but he kept his soul free from the stain of this crime. They, involved in the mazes of impious idolatry, enthralled first themselves, and then all under their authority and bondage of the errors of evil demons, while he, at the same time, originated the profoundest peace throughout his dominions, and secured to his subjects the privilege of celebrating without hindrance the worship of God. In short, while his colleagues oppressed all men by the most grievous exactions, rendered their lives intolerable, and even worse than death, Constantius alone governed his people with a mild and tranquil sway, and exhibited towards them a truly parental and fostering care. End quote. It is important to note the ambiguous use of supreme God in this passage, and I have attached M.D. Smith's analysis of this. In using this phrase, Eusebius makes Constantius a pagan henotheist at minimum, and at most a follower of the Christian God. The next chapter in the life of Constantine is bizarre, as Eusebius himself admits. Eusebius seems to imply that Constantius tested his court by instructing them to sacrifice to demons. What is meant by this is uncertain. Does it mean pagan deities outside of the supreme deity? Or does it refer to superstitions outside permitted Roman religion? The episode is described as follows. Quote, "On the other hand, Constantius conceived an expedient full of sagacity, and did a thing which sounds paradoxical, but in fact was most admirable. He made a proposal to all the officers of his court, including even those in the highest stations of authority, offering them the following alternative: either that they should offer sacrifice to demons, and thus be permitted to remain with him, and enjoy their usual honours, or, in case of refusal, that they should be shut out from all access to his person, and entirely disqualified from acquaintance and association with him. Accordingly, when they had individually made their choice, some one way and some another, and the choice of each had been ascertained, then this admirable prince disclosed the secret meaning of his expedient, and condemned the cowardice and selfishness of the one party, while he highly commended the other for their conscientious devotion to God. He declared too, that those who had been false to their God must be unworthy of the confidence of their prince, for how was it possible that they should preserve their fidelity to him, who had proved themselves faithless to a higher power? He determined, therefore, that such persons should be removed altogether from the imperial court, while on the other hand, declaring that those men who, in bearing witness for the truth, had proved themselves to be worthy servants of God, would manifest the same fidelity to their king. He entrusted them with the guardianship of his person and empire, saying that he was bound to treat such persons with special regard as his nearest and most valued friends, and to esteem them far more highly than his richest treasures." End quote. Certainly rather odd, and you can make of it what you will. In my view, and I stress this is my own conjecture, there can only be the smallest morsel of truth to this story, and the rest is embellishment. In the next chapter, Eusebius stresses Constantius and his household's harmony with the supreme God, and again equates this with an affinity for Christianity. The passage is as follows. Quote, "The father of Constantine, then, is said to have possessed such a character as we have briefly described, and what kind of death was vouchsafed to him in consequence of such devotion to God, and how far he whom he honoured made his lot differ from that of his colleagues in the empire, may be known to anyone who will give his attention to the circumstances of the case. For after he had for a long time given many proofs of royal virtue, in acknowledging the supreme God alone, and condemning the polytheism of the ungodly, and had fortified his household by the prayers of holy men, he passed the remainder of his life in remarkable repose and tranquillity, in enjoyment of what is counted blessedness, neither molesting others, nor being molested ourselves. Accordingly, during the whole course of his quiet and peaceful reign, he dedicated his entire household, his children, his wife, and domestic attendants, to the one supreme God, so that the company assembled within the walls of his palace differed in no respect from a church of God, wherein were also to be found his ministers, who offered continual supplications on behalf of their prince, and this at a time when, with most, it was not allowable to have any dealings with the worshippers of God, even so far as to exchange a word with them." End quote. It's not hard to understand how this account of Constantius found its way into these works. Both Lactantius and Eusebius knew Constantine personally. Lactantius was heavily involved in Constantine's court, to the point that he was the tutor of Constantine's son Crispus around the year 317, as evidenced in the Chronicle of Jerome. Eusebius was an influential bishop, and states in the life of Constantine that he received some of his information in person from Constantine himself. However, both men lived in the east during the reign of Constantius, so their testimony about him is not first-hand. In the life of Constantine, Eusebius preserves a letter from Constantine, in which Constantine himself stresses his father's non-involvement in the persecution. Unfortunately, Constantine was a master statesman, so we can't say whether Constantine is telling the truth, or is instead the source of this revision of his father's legacy. The letter states the following. Quote, "The former emperors I have been accustomed to regard as those with whom I could have no sympathy, on account of the savage cruelty of their character. Indeed, my father was the only one who uniformly practiced the duties of humanity, and with admirable piety called for the blessing of God the Father on all his actions, but the rest, unsound in mind, were more zealous of cruel than gentle measures, and this disposition they indulged without restraint, and thus persecuted the true doctrine during the whole period of their reign. Nay, so violent did their malicious fury become, that in the midst of a profound peace, as regards both the religious and ordinary interests of men, they kindled, as it were, the flames of a civil war." End quote. Once again, note the vague use of God the Father here. This could imply that Constantius was some sort of henotheist, or that he was a follower of the Christian religion. So what is going on here? I believe we can view these sources in two ways. The first way is that Lactantius and Eusebius are stating what they believe to be true. Scholars argue that Lactantius was in the West shortly after Constantine's ascension in 306. Regardless, we have good evidence that he was in the West to tutor Crispus in Trier sometime later. Perhaps Constantius wasn't much of a persecutor after all, but Lactantius' presence in the West allowed him insight to some testimony of destroyed buildings. Eusebius, being thoroughly Eastern, did not receive these reports. Perhaps Eusebius did genuinely report what he was told about Constantius, as far-fetched as that seems, but the issue lies with those reporting to him. On the other hand, what we may be seeing is a gradual change in the way state propaganda approaches Constantius. Perhaps Lactantius, knowing he can't get away with outright denying Constantius' role in the persecution, seeks to minimise it. With Eusebius' church history, written later, the narrative has changed so that Constantius played no role whatsoever. Then, by the time Eusebius is writing the life of Constantine, the narrative has developed further, so that Constantius is actively expelling demon worshippers, has a Christian court and household, and is a follower of something similar to the Christian God. The next source we will visit is quite a strange one. Opatus was a Christian bishop who around the year 370 wrote a history of the Donatist dispute within the Christian church that occurred in the 320s. He preserves a letter from the Donatists which seems to corroborate the fact that Constantius did not persecute Christians. This is important because it is a Christian source from the western half of the empire that was under the auspices of Constantius. Unfortunately, the Donatists are looking for Constantine's favour in this letter, which means they may not be impartial witnesses. Now for a quick counterpoint to break up the Christian sources. The Emperor Julian, a prolific writer, wrote a hymn to King Helios, the solar deity. In this work, Julian implies that he descends from at least 3 generations of solar worshippers, and this would include Constantius I, who was Julian's grandfather. However, Julian would have just as much interest in allying Constantius to his cause as would the Christians, because Julian was attempting a centralised and philosophically driven revival of Roman polytheism. Therefore, this source should be treated with care, particularly because of its vagueness. Quote, "Now far the best thing is when anyone has the fortune to have inherited the service of the god, even before the 3rd generation, from a long and unbroken line of ancestors. Yet it is not a thing to be disparaged when anyone, recognising that he is by nature intended to be the servant of Helios, either alone of all men or in company with but few, devotes himself to the service of his master." End quote. Our final source for Constantius' religious leanings is a curveball that greatly adds to the mystery. It is the first part of a document known as the Anonymous Wallisianus, which is thought to have been written around 390. This work reveals that Constantius had a daughter named Anastasia with his second wife Theodora. This would make Anastasia Constantine's half-sister, as they had different mothers. The reason this is so odd is that the name Anastasia derives from the Greek word for resurrection, and was therefore popular among Christians. As the quote shown shows, this name is dropped in a casual fashion, and there is no further elaboration. Unfortunately, we can only offer speculation as to why this name was chosen. Did Constantius or members of the imperial household have Christian leanings, as Eusebius implies? Or was it a case of mere aesthetic cultural exchange without the actual religious convictions? While on the subject of Constantius' household, you can often read that his first wife Helena, the mother of Constantine, was a Christian during their marriage, which supports the idea of his toleration and interest in this faith. However, there is no evidence for this, and Eusebius states that it was Constantine's later influence that led to Helena's conversion, leading scholars to induce that her conversion postdates Constantine's victory at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. 2 videos and sometime later, the evidence for Constantius' personal religion and his interaction with Christianity have been presented. Let me know your thoughts and interpretations in the comments, and feel free to provide suggestions for future videos that explore a specific facet of Roman history.